There's a special kind of loneliness that comes with eating supper alone, night after night, watching the sun set on another day that felt too long and too empty. Miss Eleanor Grace knew this feeling well as she sat on her schoolhouse porch in Ash Hollow, carefully dividing her simple meal of bread and beans into portions that would stretch until tomorrow. On this particular evening, a thin cowboy with hollow cheeks stops at her gate. He doesn't ask for food, just tips his hat and looks at her plate with eyes that speak louder than words. Something in his quiet dignity touches her heart. Without hesitation, she slides the plate closer and says, "Only if you stay for dessert." That simple act of kindness changes both their lives forever. What happens when two broken souls discover that the greatest courage isn't found in a gunfight, but in sharing a meal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust never settled in Ash Hollow. It hung in the air like a permanent reminder that this corner of Nebraska territory had seen better days, long before the war took its toll on everything that mattered. Eleanor Grace had watched the town slowly empty itself of hope, one family at a time, until only the stubborn and the desperate remained. She counted herself among the stubborn. At 32, Eleanor moved through her days with the measured precision of a woman who had learned that routine was the only reliable companion. Each morning, she rang the schoolhouse bell at precisely 8 o'clock, calling the 17 children who still attended classes in a town that once boasted 43 young minds. The brass bell, now dull with age and weather, had been her late husband's gift to the school 3 years ago, back when Thomas still believed their little community might flourish. The schoolhouse itself stood at the crossroads of Main Street and what optimistic town founders had once called Commerce Avenue, though no commerce had passed through in months. Eleanor had painted the clapboard walls herself last spring, a cheerful yellow that now looked faded and tired against the endless brown of the drought-stricken landscape. Inside, wooden desks, scarred by countless pocket knives and pencil marks, bore witness to generations of children who had learned their letters and numbers within these walls. Eleanor's cottage sat just behind the schoolhouse, connected by a well-worn path that she had walked thousands of times in the 3 years since Thomas's death. The small house held everything she owned in the world: a cast-iron stove that heated unevenly, a kitchen table where she graded papers by lamplight, and a bedroom where she still slept on one side of the bed, as if Thomas might return to claim his place beside her. On her left hand, she wore a simple gold band that had grown loose with her diminishing appetite. The wedding ring had become a talisman of sorts, a reminder of love that had been real and true, even if it had been brief. Thomas had been gone 3 winters now, taken by the fever that swept through the county like a cruel wind. Eleanor had tended him until the end, then buried him in the small cemetery behind the church, where the headstones of too many good people marked the price of frontier life. The children were her salvation and her purpose. Little Sarah Mitchell, barely 6 years old, who brought Eleanor wildflowers picked from the stubborn patches that still grew behind the general store. Tommy Henderson, 10 years old and already showing signs of the restless spirit that would likely take him away from Ash Hollow when he came of age. Mary and Elizabeth Carter, sisters who walked 2 miles each way to attend school, their mother determined that her daughters would have the education she never received. Eleanor taught them reading and writing, arithmetic and geography, but more importantly, she taught them that knowledge was a form of hope. In a world that seemed determined to break spirits, she insisted that learning was a way of building something that couldn't be taken away by drought or economic hardship or the simple cruelty of circumstances beyond anyone's control. The town itself struggled with the weight of its own survival. Mayor Jameson, a portly man who had inherited his position more than earned it, presided over a community that existed on stubbornness and little else. The general store, run by the Kowalski family, stayed open through sheer determination, though their shelves grew more barren with each passing month. Doc Morrison, pushing 70 and fighting his own battles with arthritis, tended to the medical needs of people who often couldn't pay him in anything but gratitude and the occasional chicken. Eleanor's evening routine never varied. After the children went home and she finished her preparations for the next day's lessons, she would cook her simple supper and carry it to the schoolhouse porch. The view from there encompassed most of what mattered in Ash Hollow: the dusty main street with its struggling businesses, the church steeple pointing toward heaven like a hopeful finger, and the vast expanse of prairie that stretched to the horizon in every direction. She ate alone because that was her choice, not because she lacked options. Widow Martha Stevens had invited her to Sunday dinners more times than she could count. The church ladies had made gentle suggestions about eligible men in neighboring towns. Even Mayor Jameson's wife had hinted that Eleanor might find companionship if she were more open to the possibility. But Eleanor had built her life around the safety of solitude. She had loved once, completely and without reservation, and when that love was taken from her, the pain had been nearly unbearable. She wouldn't risk that kind of devastation again. It was better to be alone than to open her heart to loss. On this particular evening, as she settled into her familiar routine, Eleanor noticed the stranger before he noticed her. He was leading a horse that looked as worn as he did, both of them moving with the careful gait of travelers who had pushed themselves beyond their limits. The man was tall and lean, with the kind of thinness that spoke of missed meals rather than natural build. His clothes were clean but patched, his hat weathered but well-maintained. He stopped at her gate, not because he intended to, but because his horse needed the rest. Eleanor watched him remove his hat and wipe his brow with a sleeve, revealing hair that was prematurely grey at the temples. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by lines that suggested both hardship and kindness. When he looked up and saw her watching, he didn't look away in embarrassment. Instead, he nodded politely and started to move on. But something in his expression, a quiet dignity despite his obvious hunger, made Eleanor speak before she could stop herself. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. He paused, turning back toward her. "Evening, Mum." His voice was rough from disuse, but respectful. Eleanor found herself studying his face, noting the hollow beneath his cheekbones, the way his shirt hung loose on his frame. Without quite knowing why, she said, "You look like you could use a meal." He straightened slightly, as if her words had somehow insulted him. "I wouldn't want to impose, ma'am, just passing through." "It's no imposition," Eleanor heard herself saying. "I always cook more than I can eat." This was a lie, but it felt like the kind of lie that served a greater truth. The stranger hesitated, clearly torn between pride and hunger. Eleanor made the decision for both of them by rising from her chair and walking to the gate. Up close, she could see that his eyes were brown and kind, despite the exhaustion that lined his face. "I'm Eleanor Grace," she said, extending her hand. He took it gently, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "Reed Mallory, ma'am, and I'm grateful for your kindness, though I don't deserve it." "Kindness isn't something you deserve," Eleanor replied, surprised by her own words. "It's something you receive." That evening, as Reed Mallory shared her simple meal of bread and beans, Eleanor found herself talking more than she had in months. He was a good listener, asking thoughtful questions about her teaching and the children, never pressing for information about her personal life. In return, he shared small details about his travels, the towns he'd passed through, the people he'd met along the way. When she offered him the last piece of cornbread she had baked that morning, he accepted it with the gratitude of a man who understood the value of simple gifts. And when she said, "Only if you stay for dessert," presenting him with a small portion of dried apple compote, his smile transformed his entire face. "Thank you, Miss Grace," he said quietly. "This is the finest meal I've had in longer than I care to remember." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a warmth she hadn't experienced in 3 years. As Reed prepared to leave, she found herself saying, "If you're still in town tomorrow evening, you're welcome to join me again." He paused at the gate, hat in hand. "I'd be honored, ma'am, if you're certain it wouldn't be too much trouble." "No trouble at all," Eleanor replied, and meant it completely. After he disappeared into the gathering darkness, Eleanor sat on her porch for a long time, her empty plate forgotten in her lap. For the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy, and the approaching night didn't seem quite so endless. She touched her wedding ring, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for unexpected kindness and the possibility that loneliness wasn't a permanent condition after all. The dust never settled in Ash Hollow. It hung in the air like a permanent reminder that this corner of Nebraska territory had seen better days, long before the war took its toll on everything that mattered. Eleanor Grace had watched the town slowly empty itself of hope, one family at a time, until only the stubborn and the desperate remained. She counted herself among the stubborn. At 32, Eleanor moved through her days with the measured precision of a woman who had learned that routine was the only reliable companion. Each morning, she rang the schoolhouse bell at precisely 8 o'clock, calling the 17 children who still attended classes in a town that once boasted 43 young minds. The brass bell, now dull with age and weather, had been her late husband's gift to the school 3 years ago, back when Thomas still believed their little community might flourish. The schoolhouse itself stood at the crossroads of Main Street and what optimistic town founders had once called Commerce Avenue, though no commerce had passed through in months. Eleanor had painted the clapboard walls herself last spring, a cheerful yellow that now looked faded and tired against the endless brown of the drought-stricken landscape. Inside, wooden desks, scarred by countless pocket knives and pencil marks, bore witness to generations of children who had learned their letters and numbers within these walls. Eleanor's cottage sat just behind the schoolhouse, connected by a well-worn path that she had walked thousands of times in the 3 years since Thomas's death. The small house held everything she owned in the world: a cast-iron stove that heated unevenly, a kitchen table where she graded papers by lamplight, and a bedroom where she still slept on one side of the bed, as if Thomas might return to claim his place beside her. On her left hand, she wore a simple gold band that had grown loose with her diminishing appetite. The wedding ring had become a talisman of sorts, a reminder of love that had been real and true, even if it had been brief. Thomas had been gone 3 winters now, taken by the fever that swept through the county like a cruel wind. Eleanor had tended him until the end, then buried him in the small cemetery behind the church, where the headstones of too many good people marked the price of frontier life. The children were her salvation and her purpose. Little Sarah Mitchell, barely 6 years old, who brought Eleanor wildflowers picked from the stubborn patches that still grew behind the general store. Tommy Henderson, 10 years old and already showing signs of the restless spirit that would likely take him away from Ash Hollow when he came of age. Mary and Elizabeth Carter, sisters who walked 2 miles each way to attend school, their mother determined that her daughters would have the education she never received. Eleanor taught them reading and writing, arithmetic and geography, but more importantly, she taught them that knowledge was a form of hope. In a world that seemed determined to break spirits, she insisted that learning was a way of building something that couldn't be taken away by drought or economic hardship or the simple cruelty of circumstances beyond anyone's control. The town itself struggled with the weight of its own survival. Mayor Jameson, a portly man who had inherited his position more than earned it, presided over a community that existed on stubbornness and little else. The general store, run by the Kowalski family, stayed open through sheer determination, though their shelves grew more barren with each passing month. Doc Morrison, pushing 70 and fighting his own battles with arthritis, tended to the medical needs of people who often couldn't pay him in anything but gratitude and the occasional chicken. Eleanor's evening routine never varied. After the children went home and she finished her preparations for the next day's lessons, she would cook her simple supper and carry it to the schoolhouse porch. The view from there encompassed most of what mattered in Ash Hollow: the dusty main street with its struggling businesses, the church steeple pointing toward heaven like a hopeful finger, and the vast expanse of prairie that stretched to the horizon in every direction. She ate alone because that was her choice, not because she lacked options. Widow Martha Stevens had invited her to Sunday dinners more times than she could count. The church ladies had made gentle suggestions about eligible men in neighboring towns. Even Mayor Jameson's wife had hinted that Eleanor might find companionship if she were more open to the possibility. But Eleanor had built her life around the safety of solitude. She had loved once, completely and without reservation, and when that love was taken from her, the pain had been nearly unbearable. She wouldn't risk that kind of devastation again. It was better to be alone than to open her heart to loss. On this particular evening, as she settled into her familiar routine, Eleanor noticed the stranger before he noticed her. He was leading a horse that looked as worn as he did, both of them moving with the careful gait of travelers who had pushed themselves beyond their limits. The man was tall and lean, with the kind of thinness that spoke of missed meals rather than natural build. His clothes were clean but patched, his hat weathered but well-maintained. He stopped at her gate, not because he intended to, but because his horse needed the rest. Eleanor watched him remove his hat and wipe his brow with a sleeve, revealing hair that was prematurely grey at the temples. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by lines that suggested both hardship and kindness. When he looked up and saw her watching, he didn't look away in embarrassment. Instead, he nodded politely and started to move on. But something in his expression, a quiet dignity despite his obvious hunger, made Eleanor speak before she could stop herself. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. He paused, turning back toward her. "Evening, Mum." His voice was rough from disuse, but respectful. Eleanor found herself studying his face, noting the hollow beneath his cheekbones, the way his shirt hung loose on his frame. Without quite knowing why, she said, "You look like you could use a meal." He straightened slightly, as if her words had somehow insulted him. "I wouldn't want to impose, Ma'am, just passing through." "It's no imposition," Eleanor heard herself saying. "I always cook more than I can eat." This was a lie, but it felt like the kind of lie that served a greater truth. The stranger hesitated, clearly torn between pride and hunger. Eleanor made the decision for both of them by rising from her chair and walking to the gate. Up close, she could see that his eyes were brown and kind, despite the exhaustion that lined his face. "I'm Eleanor Grace," she said, extending her hand. He took it gently, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "Reed Mallory, Ma'am, and I'm grateful for your kindness, though I don't deserve it." "Kindness isn't something you deserve," Eleanor replied, surprised by her own words. "It's something you receive." That evening, as Reed Mallory shared her simple meal of bread and beans, Eleanor found herself talking more than she had in months. He was a good listener, asking thoughtful questions about her teaching and the children, never pressing for information about her personal life. In return, he shared small details about his travels, the towns he'd passed through, the people he'd met along the way. When she offered him the last piece of cornbread she had baked that morning, he accepted it with the gratitude of a man who understood the value of simple gifts. And when she said, "Only if you stay for dessert," presenting him with a small portion of dried apple compote, his smile transformed his entire face. "Thank you, Miss Grace," he said quietly. "This is the finest meal I've had in longer than I care to remember." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a warmth she hadn't experienced in 3 years. As Reed prepared to leave, she found herself saying, "If you're still in town tomorrow evening, you're welcome to join me again." He paused at the gate, hat in hand. "I'd be honored, Ma'am, if you're certain it wouldn't be too much trouble." "No trouble at all," Eleanor replied, and meant it completely. After he disappeared into the gathering darkness, Eleanor sat on her porch for a long time, her empty plate forgotten in her lap. For the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy, and the approaching night didn't seem quite so endless. She touched her wedding ring, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for unexpected kindness and the possibility that loneliness wasn't a permanent condition after all. Reed Mallory returned the next evening, just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. This time, He didn't hesitate at the gate. Eleanor had been watching for him, though she told herself it was merely coincidence that she happened to be looking down the road when his tall figure appeared. "Miss Grace," he said, removing his hat as he approached the porch. "Mr. Mallory," she replied, pleased that her voice sounded steady. "I was hoping you'd come back." Over the following week, their evening meals became a ritual that neither acknowledged but both cherished. Reed would arrive as Eleanor finished her teaching duties, always offering to help with small tasks around the schoolhouse before they shared their simple supper. He proved handy with repairs, fixing a loose shutter and tightening the hinges on the front door with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to making do with whatever tools were available. The children began to notice him, peering through the schoolhouse windows as he worked in the yard. Reed acknowledged their curiosity with gentle nods and the occasional wave, but he never intruded on Eleanor's teaching time. She appreciated his respect for her professional boundaries, even as she found herself increasingly curious about the man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't realized she was praying. On the seventh evening, as they shared a meal of vegetable soup and fresh biscuits, Eleanor finally asked the question that had been growing in her mind. "Where are you traveling to, Mr. Mallory?" Reed paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Nowhere in particular, ma'am. Just moving." "A man doesn't travel without purpose," Eleanor said gently. "At least, not for long." Reed set down his spoon and looked out across the prairie, his expression distant. "Sometimes a man travels because staying in one place hurts too much." Eleanor understood that kind of pain. She had felt the urge to run many times in the months after Thomas's death, to pack her few belongings and disappear into the vastness of the frontier where memories couldn't follow. Only her commitment to the children had kept her rooted to Ash Hollow. "What hurts?" she asked softly. Reed was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Remembering what I lost, forgetting what I was supposed to protect." Eleanor wanted to reach across the small space between their chairs and touch his hand, but she restrained herself. Instead, she said, "Sometimes the best way to honor what we've lost is to protect what we still have." Reed looked at her then, his brown eyes reflecting a pain so deep that Eleanor felt it as a physical ache in her chest. "And what if what we still have isn't ours to protect?" "Then maybe we're meant to find something new to care for," Eleanor replied. That night, after Reed had said his goodbyes and disappeared into the darkness, Eleanor sat on her porch longer than usual. She found herself thinking not about Thomas, as she usually did during these quiet evening hours, but about the man who had brought an unexpected gentleness into her carefully ordered world. Reed's worn saddlebags, which he carried with him everywhere, seemed to hold more than just the practical belongings of a traveling man. Eleanor had noticed how he guarded them, never letting them far from his sight, as if they contained something precious or dangerous. She wondered what secrets a man like Reed Mallory might be carrying, and whether those secrets were part of what kept him moving from town to town like a ghost seeking rest. The following morning brought an unexpected challenge that would test the fragile trust building between Eleanor and Reed. As she rang the school bell to call the children to their lessons, she noticed that young Tommy Henderson was missing. This was unusual, as Tommy's mother was strict about school attendance, believing education was her son's best hope for a better life than the hard-scrabble existence that defined most families in Ash Hollow. At midday, when Tommy still hadn't appeared, Eleanor dismissed the other children for their lunch break and walked to the Henderson farm. She found Mrs. Henderson in her kitchen, her face drawn with worry. "Tommy took off before dawn," Mrs. Henderson explained, wringing her hands in her apron. "He's been talking about finding work in the next county, says he's old enough to help support the family. I told him education comes first, but you know how boys can be when they get an idea in their heads." Eleanor knew exactly how boys could be, especially boys who felt the weight of family responsibility pressing down on their young shoulders. "Which direction did he go?" "Toward Miller's Creek, I think. There's been talk of work at the lumber camp there." Mrs. Henderson's voice cracked slightly. He's only 10 years old, Miss Grace. He's got no business trying to find work among grown men. Eleanor made a decision that surprised her with its swiftness. I'll find him and bring him back. You can't go alone, Mrs. Henderson protested. It's 15 miles to Miller's Creek, and there's rough country between here and there. Eleanor was already mentally planning her route when she remembered Reed. He would be at the schoolhouse by now, probably wondering where she had gone. The thought of asking for his help felt both natural and terrifying. Natural, because she trusted him. Terrifying because trusting him meant admitting how much his presence had come to matter to her. She found Reed exactly where she expected, sitting on the schoolhouse steps with his hat pushed back on his head, looking concerned. When she explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. I'll saddle my horse, he said, rising immediately. We can ride double, cover the distance faster than you could on foot. You don't have to, Eleanor began. Yes, I do, Reed interrupted gently. That boy matters to you, which means he matters to me. The simple declaration sent warmth through Eleanor's chest. She watched Reed prepare his horse with practiced efficiency, noting the careful way he secured his saddlebags and checked the cinch twice. When he helped her mount behind him, his hands were steady and respectful, but Eleanor felt the strength in his grip and the solid warmth of his back as she settled against him. They rode through the afternoon heat, following the dusty trail that led toward Miller's Creek. Reed proved to be an excellent tracker, pointing out signs that Tommy had indeed passed this Weir boot print in the soft earth near a stream, a broken branch at exactly the right height for a boy of Tommy's size. As they rode, Eleanor found herself studying the landscape with new eyes. From horseback, with Reed's solid presence in front of her, the endless prairie didn't seem quite so intimidating. The vast sky that usually made her feel small now seemed like a canopy of possibilities stretching to infinity. There, Reed said, pointing toward a cluster of buildings in the distance. That'll be Miller's Creek. They found Tommy at the lumber camp, looking even smaller than his 10 years, as he stood among the rough men who worked the timber. The camp foreman, a bear of a man with hands like tree stumps, was explaining with gruff kindness that the camp didn't hire children, no matter how willing they might be to work. Tommy Henderson, Eleanor called as they approached. Your mother is worried sick about you. Tommy's face flushed red, with embarrassment and defiance. I can work, Miss Grace. I'm strong enough. I know you are, Eleanor said, dismounting from Reed's horse with his assistance. But strength isn't just about what your body can do. It's about knowing when to use that strength and when to wait for the right opportunity. Reed stepped forward, his voice calm and measured. Son, I've worked in places like this. The work is hard and dangerous, and it's no place for a boy who's got the chance for something better. What's better than earning money to help my family? Tommy demanded. Learning skills that will let you help them for the rest of your life, not just for the next few months, Reed replied. I never had the chance for proper schooling. I've regretted that every day since. Something in Reed's tone-honest regret, mixed with gentle authority, seemed to reach Tommy in a way that Eleanor's logical arguments couldn't. The boy's defiant posture softened slightly. Education is an investment in your future, Eleanor added, and your family's future. You finish your schooling and you'll be able to help them in ways that no amount of lumber camp wages could match. The ride back to Ash Hollow was quieter, with Tommy mounted in front of Reed and Eleanor riding behind. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Eleanor felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. Not just because they had successfully retrieved Tommy, but because she and Reed had worked together as naturally as if they had been partners for years. That evening, after they had returned Tommy to his grateful mother, and Eleanor had endured Mrs. Henderson's tearful thanks, she and Reed sat on the schoolhouse porch, sharing their delayed supper. The familiar ritual felt different now, charged with new understanding and deeper trust. Thank you, Eleanor said as they finished their meal. For helping with Tommy, for not hesitating when I needed you. Reed studied her face in the lamplight that spilled from the schoolhouse windows. Thank you for trusting me enough to ask. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition that their relationship had moved beyond polite courtesy into something more substantial. Eleanor felt it as a warming in her chest, a sense of possibility that both thrilled and frightened her. "Reed," she said, using his first name for the first time, "I hope you'll consider staying in Ash Hollow. Not just for a few more days, but for as long as you'd like." Reed was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I'd like that more than you know, Eleanor, but I'm not sure I have the right to stay." "What do you mean?" Reed looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of hard work. "There are things about me you don't know, things that might change how you feel about having me around." Eleanor felt a chill of apprehension, but she pushed it aside. "We all have things in our past that we're not proud of. That doesn't mean we can't choose to be better than we were." "Some things can't be forgiven," Reed said quietly. "I don't believe that," Eleanor replied with quiet conviction. "I believe in redemption. I believe people can change. And I believe that sometimes the best thing we can do is give someone a chance to prove they're better than their worst moment." Reed looked up at her then, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You have more faith in people than they deserve." "Maybe," Eleanor said, "but I'd rather have too much faith than too little." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars appeared overhead, each lost in their own thoughts, but sharing the peace of the moment. Eleanor knew that Reed was carrying secrets, and she suspected that those secrets were weighing heavily on his conscience. But she also knew that the man who had helped her find Tommy, who had spoken to the boy with such gentle wisdom, who had spent his evenings sharing simple meals and quiet conversation with a lonely schoolteacher, that man was good, whatever his past might hold. As Reed prepared to leave that night, Eleanor made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 2 weeks earlier. "Reed, there's a shed behind my cottage. It's not much, but it's dry and warm. If you're planning to stay in Ash Hollow for a while, you're welcome to use it." Reed stopped, his hand on the gate latch. "Eleanor, that's generous, but people will talk." "Let them talk," Eleanor said with a firmness that surprised them both. "I'm a grown woman, and I can make my own decisions about who I invite onto my property." Reed turned back to face her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Are you sure?" Eleanor thought of her wedding ring, still snug on her finger, and of Thomas's memory, which would always be part of her. But she also thought of the loneliness that had defined her life for 3 years, and of the unexpected warmth that Reed's presence had brought to her days. "I'm sure," she said. 3 days after Reed moved into the small shed behind Eleanor's cottage, disaster struck with the swift cruelty that frontier life was known for. Eleanor was leading her students through their morning arithmetic lesson when she heard the sound that would change everything, heavy thud followed by an ominous silence from the yard where Reed had been repairing the schoolhouse's front steps. She excused herself and stepped outside to find Reed collapsed beside his toolbox, his face pale and his breathing shallow. His worn saddlebags lay scattered beside him, their contents spilled across the dusty ground. Among the few possessions, a spare shirt, a battered cup, some jerky wrapped in cloth, Eleanor noticed something that made her breath catch. A folded piece of paper that looked official, bearing what appeared to be a military seal. But her concern for Reed's immediate welfare pushed all other thoughts aside. She knelt beside him, placing her hand on his forehead and finding it burning with fever. His lips were cracked, his skin had the grayish pallor of serious illness, and when she tried to rouse him, he only mumbled incoherently. "Children," she called, trying to keep her voice calm despite the panic rising in her chest. "I need you to gather your things and go home for the day. Tell your parents that school will resume tomorrow." Little Sarah Mitchell, always the most observant of her students, peered around Eleanor's skirts at Reed's still form. "Is Mr. Reed going to be all right, Miss Grace?" "He's going to be fine," Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. "Now hurry along, all of you." Once the children had scattered toward their homes, Eleanor faced the challenge of getting Reed inside. He was a tall man, all sinew and bone, and even in his weakened state, he was more weight than she could manage alone. Desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She managed to rouse him enough to get his arm around her shoulders. and together they stumbled the short distance to her cottage. Getting him to her bedroom required every ounce of determination Eleanor possessed. She had no choice but to strip him down to his underclothes, to properly tend to his fever, a necessity that would have scandalized the town's more proper residents, but which seemed perfectly natural under the circumstances. His body bore the evidence of a hard, life-old scars that spoke of violence, muscles developed through manual labor, and the telltale marks of poor nutrition over an extended period. Eleanor spent the afternoon applying cool cloths to his forehead and trying to get water between his parched lips. As evening approached, Reed's condition worsened. He began to thrash restlessly, muttering words that Eleanor couldn't quite make out. She caught fragments names that might have been comrades, locations that sounded like battlefields, and repeatedly the word sorry, spoken with such anguish that it broke her heart. By the second day, when Reed's fever showed no signs of breaking, Eleanor knew she needed help. She swallowed her pride and sent word to Doc Morrison, knowing that the old doctor's arrival would set tongues wagging throughout Ash Hollow. A single woman caring for a sick man in her own home was exactly the kind of situation that gave the town's gossips plenty to discuss. Doc Morrison arrived within the hour, his medical bag in one hand and a stern expression on his weathered face. Eleanor had expected judgment, but instead found compassion. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and probably a touch of pneumonia, the doctor diagnosed after his examination. This man's been pushing himself far beyond his limits for quite some time. When did he last have a proper meal? He's been eating with me for 2 weeks, Eleanor said defensively. I mean, before that, Doc Morrison said gently. Look at him, Eleanor. This kind of physical deterioration doesn't happen overnight. This man's been slowly starving for months, maybe longer. The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Reed had never once complained about hunger, never asked for more food than she offered, never given any indication that the simple meals they shared were insufficient for his needs. His quiet dignity had masked a desperation that she had been too caught up in her own emotional awakening to recognize. What do I do? She asked. Keep him warm, keep trying to get fluids into him and pray, Doc Morrison said. His body's trying to recover from months of abuse. Either it will or it won't. That night, as Eleanor maintained her vigil beside Reed's bed, the first of the town's concerned citizens came calling. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife and unofficial keeper of Ash Hollow's moral standards, appeared at Eleanor's door with a covered dish and barely concealed disapproval. I heard about your visitor's condition, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice dripping with false concern. Such a burden for you, caring for a stranger. Perhaps it would be better if we arranged for Mr. Mallory to be moved to more appropriate accommodations. Eleanor understood exactly what Mrs. Patterson was suggesting, that Reed should be moved to the crude boarding house where transients usually stayed, a place that was little better than a barn and wholly unsuitable for a seriously ill man. Mr. Mallory will remain here until he's well, Eleanor said firmly. He's under my care. Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose to her hairline. Eleanor, dear, you must consider how this looks. An unmarried woman, a strange man in your home, in your bedroom. He's sick, and I'm tending to him, Eleanor interrupted. If that offends your sensibilities, Mrs. Patterson, I suggest you examine your priorities. The older woman's face flushed with indignation. Well, I never. Eleanor Grace, your poor dear Thomas would be ashamed of your behavior. The mention of Thomas hit Eleanor like a slap, but instead of crumbling, she felt her resolve strengthen. Thomas would expect me to help someone in need, regardless of what small-minded people might say about it. After Mrs. Patterson left in a huff, Eleanor returned to Reed's bedside. His fever had broken slightly, but he was still unconscious, still fighting whatever demons haunted his delirium. She took his hand in hers, noting how calloused and scarred his fingers were, evidence of a lifetime of hard work and harder circumstances. Fight, she whispered. Whatever you're carrying, whatever you're running from, don't let it win. On the third night, Reed's fever finally broke completely. Eleanor woke from an exhausted doze in the chair beside his bed to find him looking at her with clear, cognizant eyes. "Eleanor," he said, his voice hoarse but rational. "What happened?" "You collapsed," she said, relief flooding through her. "You've been sick for 3 days." Reed tried to sit up, but Eleanor pressed him back against the pillows. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," Reed admitted. "But better, clearer." He looked around the room, taking in his surroundings with growing awareness. "This is your bedroom." "You needed proper care," Eleanor said simply. Reed's face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. "Eleanor, you shouldn't have people will talk." "Let them talk," Eleanor said, repeating the words she had spoken to Mrs. Patterson. "You needed help, and I was in a position to provide it." Reed closed his eyes, and Eleanor saw his jaw tighten with emotion. "You don't understand what you've risked. Your reputation, your position in this community." "My reputation will survive," Eleanor said. "The question is, will you?" Reed opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression so intense that Eleanor felt her breath catch. "Why would you do this for me? You barely know me." Eleanor considered the question seriously. Why had she risked social censure to care for a man she had known for less than 3 weeks? The answer came to her with startling clarity. "Because you matter," she said simply. "You matter to me." Reed's eyes filled with tears that he tried unsuccessfully to hide. "Eleanor, there are things about me." "I don't care," Eleanor interrupted. "Whatever you think I need to know about your past, it doesn't change the fact that you're a good man who deserves care and kindness." Reed was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to memorize it. "You have more faith in me than I have in myself." "Then maybe it's time you started seeing yourself through someone else's eyes," Eleanor said. Over the next few days, as Reed slowly regained his strength, Eleanor became acutely aware of how her decision to care for him had affected her standing in the community. Some people, like Doc Morrison and surprisingly Mayor Jameson, supported her choice. Others, led by Mrs. Patterson and her circle of morally superior friends, made their disapproval known through pointed looks and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when Eleanor appeared. The children, with their uncomplicated acceptance of the unusual situation, provided the most honest gauge of community sentiment. Most of them were simply glad that Mr. Reed was feeling better and would soon be able to continue his work around the schoolhouse. But Tommy Henderson, still grateful for Reed's role in bringing him home from Miller's Creek, became Reed's most vocal defender among his peers. "Mr. Reed's a good man," Tommy announced to anyone who would listen. "He helped me understand why school matters. Miss Grace was right to take care of him." Eleanor found herself both touched by Tommy's loyalty and concerned about the burden of defending their arrangement that the children might feel compelled to shoulder. She called Tommy aside one afternoon as school was ending. "Tommy, I appreciate your support, but you don't need to defend Mr. Reed or me to anyone," she said gently. "Adults sometimes disagree about things, and that's their business to sort out." Tommy considered this with the seriousness that characterized all his thoughts. "But they're wrong about him, Miss Grace, and they're wrong about you too." "Maybe they are," Eleanor agreed. "But people have the right to their opinions, even when we think those opinions are unfair." "That doesn't make the opinions right," Tommy said, with the moral clarity that only children possessed. Eleanor smiled at his earnestness. "No, it doesn't. But it does mean we have to be strong enough to do what we think is right, regardless of what other people say." That evening, as Reed joined her for their first shared meal since his illness, Eleanor reflected on how much had changed in just 1 week. Reed was still pale and thinner than before, but his eyes had regained their warmth, and his movements had lost the desperate edge that she now realized had characterized them from the beginning. "I've been thinking," Reed said as they finished their simple supper of soup and bread. "Maybe it would be better if I moved on, find another town where my presence won't cause problems for you." Eleanor felt a stab of panic at the thought of Reed leaving. "Is that what you want?" "What I want and what's best for you might be 2 different things," Reed said quietly. Eleanor set down her spoon and looked directly at him. Read Mallory. I am a grown woman, perfectly capable of making my own decisions about what's best for me. If you want to leave because you're not happy here, that's your choice. But don't you dare leave because you think you're protecting me from gossip. Reed smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since his recovery. You're a remarkable woman, Eleanor Grace. I'm a stubborn woman who knows her own mind, Eleanor corrected. Now, are you planning to stay, or do I need to start looking for someone else to fix my front steps? Reed's smile widened. I suppose the steps do need finishing. They certainly do, Eleanor agreed. And after that, the schoolhouse could use some work on the roof, and the fence around my garden is in terrible shape. Sounds like you're planning to keep me busy for quite a while, Reed observed. I certainly am, Eleanor said, and realized that she meant it with every fiber of her being. That night, as Reed returned to the small shed that had become his home, Eleanor sat on her porch and looked up at the stars. 3 days of nursing him through his illness had changed something fundamental in their relationship. She had seen him vulnerable and broken, had witnessed the demons that haunted his sleep, and had chosen to stay by his side through all of it. In return, Reed had trusted her with his weakness, had allowed her to care for him in the most intimate way possible, without crossing the boundaries of propriety. The experience had created a bond between them that went deeper than their previous gentle courtship. Eleanor touched her wedding ring, as she did every night, but for the first time in 3 years, the gesture felt less like clinging to the past and more like honoring it before moving forward. Thomas would always be part of her story, but perhaps it was time to start writing new chapters. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor made a decision that both thrilled and terrified her. Tomorrow, she would ask Reed to stay in Ash Hollow permanently. She would offer him steady work around the school and a place in the community, if he wanted it. More importantly, she would offer him a place in her life that went beyond shared meals and polite conversation. She had spent 3 years protecting herself from the possibility of loss, but Reed's illness had shown her something important. The pain of potentially losing someone you cared about was nothing compared to the emptiness of never caring about anyone at all. Eleanor fell asleep that night with Reed's worn saddlebags on her mind, particularly that official-looking document she had glimpsed when his belongings scattered during his collapse. She had respected his privacy by not examining it more closely, but something about that paper troubled her. It had looked like military correspondence, formal and official in a way that seemed at odds with Reed's simple story of being a drifter looking for work. She told herself that everyone had secrets, and Reed would share his when he was ready. But as sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that whatever secrets Reed was carrying might be more complicated and potentially more dangerous than she had imagined. The brass bell that called Ash Hollow's children to their lessons each morning had been silent for far too long. Eleanor stood in the schoolhouse doorway, watching Reed work with quiet efficiency to repair the bell's mounting bracket, which had loosened during the winter storms. His recovery from the fever had been remarkable, though she noticed he still tired more easily than before and took care to eat every morsel of food she prepared for their shared meals. The bracket was cracked clean through, Reed said, testing the repair with gentle pressure. Must have been hanging by a thread for months. It's a wonder the whole thing didn't come down during the last windstorm. Eleanor watched his hands as he worked, scarred, calloused hands that moved with surprising gentleness despite their obvious strength. Over the past week, since his recovery, she had become acutely aware of Reed's physical presence in ways that both comforted and unsettled her. There was something deeply reassuring about having a man around to handle the repairs and maintenance that she had struggled with alone for 3 years. But there was also an intimacy to their daily interactions that made her hyper-aware of every shared glance and accidental touch. "It belonged to my husband," Eleanor said, running her fingers along the smooth brass surface. "Thomas saved for months to buy it for the school. He said every proper schoolhouse needed a proper bell." Reed paused in his work, his expression growing thoughtful. "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Eleanor agreed. "He believed in building things that would last, in making improvements that would benefit people long after he was gone." Reed resumed his work, but Eleanor caught something in his expression, a tightness around his eyes, that suggested her words had touched on something painful. She was learning to read the subtle changes in his demeanor, the way his jaw would clench when certain topics arose, the way his hands would still when his thoughts turned inward. "There," Reed said, stepping back to admire his work. "That should hold for another 20 years, assuming the weather cooperates." Eleanor reached for the bell rope and gave it a gentle pull. The clear, bright tone rang out across the schoolyard, and within minutes, children began appearing from various directions, drawn by the familiar call to learning. "Mr. Reed fixed the bell," Sarah Mitchell announced as she skipped up the schoolhouse steps. "It sounds prettier than before." "Better than before," Eleanor corrected gently, but she was smiling. "And yes, Mr. Reed did an excellent job." Reed tipped his hat to Sarah and the other arriving children, but Eleanor noticed how he stepped aside to let them pass, always keeping himself slightly apart from the bustle of their arrival. She had observed this pattern over the past weeks. Reed was comfortable working around the children and would respond warmly when they spoke to him, but he never initiated contact or inserted himself into their activities uninvited. That morning's lessons went smoothly, with the children occasionally glancing out the windows to watch Reed as he moved on to his next project, rebuilding the schoolhouse's front steps, which had become dangerously uneven over the winter. Eleanor found herself glancing out as well, noting the methodical way Reed approached each task, the obvious pride he took in doing good work. During the children's lunch break, Tommy Henderson approached Reed with the direct curiosity that characterized 10-year-old boys everywhere. "Mr. Reed, were you ever a soldier?" Tommy asked, settling himself on the ground near where Reed was working. Reed's hands stilled on the piece of wood he was measuring. "What makes you ask that, son?" "The way you stand sometimes, and you know things about traveling and sleeping outdoors and stuff like that. My pa was in the war, and he stands the same way you do sometimes." Eleanor, who had been grading papers by the open schoolhouse window, found herself listening intently to the conversation. Reed's military bearing was something she had noticed as well, though she hadn't been sure how to interpret it. "I served for a time," Reed said carefully, "during the war." "Did you fight in big battles?" Tommy's eyes were bright with the fascination that boys often had for tales of adventure and conflict. Reed was quiet for a long moment, his expression distant. "I did, but war isn't much like the stories make it sound, Tommy. Mostly it's just sad and hard and something most folks would rather forget." Tommy seemed to sense that he had touched on something painful because his next question was gentler. "Is that why you travel around now? Because the war made you sad?" Reed looked at the boy with an expression that was both surprised and touched by his perceptiveness. "That's part of it, I suppose. Sometimes when bad things happen, it takes a while to figure out how to be happy again." "But you seem happier now," Tommy observed with the straightforward honesty of childhood. "Since you started eating supper with Miss Grace and fixing things around here." Reed glanced toward the schoolhouse window where Eleanor sat, and their eyes met for a moment before she looked back down at her papers, her cheeks warming. "I am happier," Reed admitted to Tommy. "This is a good place, with good people." "Are you going to stay?" Tommy asked. Eleanor held her breath, waiting for Reed's answer. "I'd like to," Reed said quietly, "if folks don't mind having me around." "Nobody minds," Tommy said with the confidence of youth. "Well, maybe Mrs. Patterson minds, but she minds everything. Miss Grace likes having you here, and so do all us kids." Eleanor felt her heart flutter at Tommy's casual observation. Was her growing affection for Reed really so obvious to the children? She tried to focus on her grading, but found herself listening as Reed gently redirected the conversation to Tommy's schoolwork and his plans for the future. That evening, as Eleanor and Reed shared their customary meal on the schoolhouse porch, she found the courage to address the topic that Tommy had raised. "The children have grown quite fond of you," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "They're good kids," Reed replied. "Smart, curious, well-behaved. You're doing fine work with them. They respond well to you too, Tommy especially. I think having a man around to talk to has been good for him." Reed nodded thoughtfully. "Boy, that age needs masculine guidance. His father's a good man, but he's stretched thin trying to keep the farm going. Tommy's at the age where he's starting to think about what kind of man he wants to become. Eleanor was struck by Reed's insight into Tommy's situation. You understand children well. Have you ever thought about teaching? Reed's laugh was short and self-deprecating. I don't have the education for teaching, Eleanor. Barely finished 6th grade myself before circumstances required me to make my own way in the world. Education isn't just about book learning, Eleanor said. You have life experience, practical skills, and a natural way with the children. Those things matter just as much as formal schooling. Reed was quiet for a moment, considering her words. I appreciate the confidence, but I think Ash Hollow needs someone more respectable than a drifter to help shape young minds. Eleanor felt a flash of irritation at his self-deprecation. Reed Mallory, you are one of the most decent, hard-working, thoughtful men I've ever known. The fact that you don't come from privilege or haven't had every advantage in life doesn't make you less worthy of respect. Reed looked at her with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and pain. You see the best in people, Eleanor. Sometimes that can be dangerous. And you see the worst in yourself, Eleanor countered. Sometimes that can be just as dangerous. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mayor Jameson, who climbed the schoolhouse steps with the deliberate pace of a man carrying weighty concerns. Eleanor and Reed both rose to greet him, though Eleanor noticed how Reed's posture shifted subtly, becoming more guarded. Good evening, Miss Grace, Mr. Mallory, the mayor said, removing his hat. I hope I'm not interrupting your supper. Not at all, Mayor, Eleanor replied. Would you care to join us? There's plenty. Thank you, but I've already eaten. I came to discuss a matter of some importance to the community. Mayor Jameson's expression was serious, but not unkind. I've been hearing talk around town about your arrangement here, Miss Grace, and I thought it best to address the situation directly. Eleanor felt her spine stiffen. What kind of talk? The kind that tends to spring up when people don't understand a situation. Mayor Jameson said diplomatically, Mrs. Patterson and some of the other ladies have expressed concerns about the propriety of having Mr. Mallory living on your property. Mr. Mallory lives in the shed behind my cottage, Eleanor said with forced calm. He earns his keep through honest work around the schoolhouse. I fail to see how that concerns anyone else. Now, Miss Grace, you know I'm not one to interfere in people's personal business, Mayor Jameson said. But as the town's elected leader, I have to consider how situations like this might affect the community's reputation. We're trying to attract new families to Ash Hollow, and some folks worry that having unmarried people living in such close proximity might give the wrong impression. Reed stepped forward slightly, his voice respectful but firm. Mayor, if my presence here is causing problems for Miss Grace or the community, I'm willing to find other accommodations. That won't be necessary, Eleanor said quickly, shooting Reed a sharp look. Mayor Jameson, I appreciate your concern for the community's reputation, but I'm a grown woman capable of making my own decisions about my living arrangements. Mayor Jameson held up his hands in a peacekeeping gesture. I'm not here to tell anyone what they can or can't do. I'm simply trying to find a solution that works for everyone involved. What kind of solution? Eleanor asked warily. Well, the town council has been discussing the possibility of creating an official position for a school maintenance supervisor. Someone to handle repairs, groundskeeping, general upkeep of the schoolhouse and other municipal buildings. The position would come with a small salary and use of the old caretaker's cottage behind the church. Eleanor and Reed exchanged glances. The caretaker's cottage had been empty for 2 years, ever since old Mr. Henley had passed away. It was a modest but respectable dwelling, and offering Reed an official position would go a long way toward legitimizing his presence in the community. That's very generous, Reed said carefully, but I'm not sure I'm the right man for such a position. There might be others in the community who are better qualified. There aren't, Mayor Jameson said bluntly. Half the men in this town can barely fix their own roofs, let alone maintain public buildings. You've done more useful work around the schoolhouse in 2 weeks than we've seen in the past 2 years. Eleanor felt a surge of pride at the recognition of Reed's contributions, but she also sensed his hesitation. Reed, it would be a perfect arrangement. You'd have steady work, a proper place to live, and an official standing in the community. I'd need time to think about it, Reed said slowly. It's a generous offer, but I don't want to accept a position if there's any chance I might not be able to fulfill my obligations. Mayor Jameson nodded understandingly. Take all the time you need. The offer will stand whenever you're ready to accept it. After the mayor left, Eleanor and Reed finished their meal in thoughtful silence. Finally, Eleanor couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. Why are you hesitating? She asked. It's exactly what you need: steady work, respect, a place in the community. Reed stared out at the darkening prairie, his expression troubled. Sometimes things that seem too good to be true usually are. This isn't too good to be true, Eleanor said firmly. This is the community recognizing your worth and offering you the chance to build a life here. And what happens if they discover that their faith in me is misplaced? Reed asked quietly. Eleanor moved her chair closer to his, close enough that their knees almost touched. Reed, what are you so afraid of? Reed looked at her then, his brown eyes reflecting a pain so deep that Eleanor felt it as a physical ache. I'm afraid of disappointing you, of disappointing all the people who've been kind to me here, of proving that Mrs. Patterson and her friends are right to be suspicious of strangers. You could never disappoint me, Eleanor said with quiet conviction. I've seen who you are, Reed Mallory. I've seen your gentleness with the children, your dedication to honest work, your respect for others. Whatever mistakes you think you've made in the past, they don't define who you are now. Reed reached out tentatively and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm and slightly rough from work, and Eleanor felt a little thrill at the contact. You have more faith in me than I deserve, he said. Then maybe it's time you started living up to that faith instead of running from it, Eleanor replied. They sat together in the gathering darkness, hands joined, each lost in their own thoughts about the future and the possibility of building something lasting together. Eleanor felt a contentment that she hadn't experienced since before Thomas's death, a sense that life was offering her a second chance at happiness. But even as she savored the moment, she couldn't shake the feeling that Reed was holding something back, some secret or burden that he wasn't ready to share. She had seen the way he sometimes looked at his saddlebags with an expression that was almost fearful, as if they contained something that might destroy the fragile peace he had found in Ash Hollow. Eleanor told herself that everyone had secrets and that trust was something that grew over time. Reed would tell her what he needed to tell her when he was ready. Until then, she would continue to show him through her actions that he had found a place where he was valued and accepted. I want to accept the mayor's offer, Reed said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet night air. Eleanor squeezed his hand. I'm so glad. But Eleanor, if things change, if people learn things about me that make them regret their kindness, I want you to know that these past few weeks have been the happiest I've known in years. Nothing's going to change, Eleanor said firmly. You're going to accept that position, move into the caretaker's cottage, and become an official member of this community. And I'm going to continue enjoying our evening meals together and watching you work magic on every broken thing in Ash Hollow. Reed smiled, the worried lines around his eyes easing slightly. You make it sound so simple. It is simple, Eleanor said. Good people deserve good things, and you, Reed Mallory, are a very good person. As Reed walked her to her cottage door that evening, Eleanor felt a sense of anticipation about the future that she hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow, Reed would accept the mayor's offer and take his first official step toward becoming a permanent member of their community. Soon, he would have a place of his own, a position of respect, and the security that came with belonging somewhere. She watched from her doorway as Reed crossed the yard to his temporary home in the shed, noting the straighter set of his shoulders and the more confident rhythm of his walk. The broken man who had collapsed in her schoolyard just weeks ago was being replaced by someone stronger, more hopeful, more willing to believe in the possibility of a better future. Eleanor touched her wedding ring one more time before going inside, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she found herself thinking not about the love she had lost, but about the love she might be finding. The brass bell that Reed had repaired would ring tomorrow morning, calling the children to their lessons and marking another day in the life of a community that was slowly learning to embrace the quiet stranger who had appeared at their schoolhouse gate like an answer to a prayer. Eleanor's late husband's Bible sat on her nightstand like a faithful guardian, its worn leather cover bearing the evidence of years of daily reading and quiet contemplation. Between its pages, pressed like precious memories, were the wildflowers Thomas had picked for her during their brief courtship, along with the love letters he had written during the early days of their marriage, when his work occasionally took him to neighboring settlements. On this particular evening, as spring began to assert itself across the Nebraska prairie, Eleanor found herself turning those familiar pages with a heavy heart. Reed had been living in the caretaker's cottage for 2 weeks now, having accepted Mayor Jameson's offer with a gratitude that still brought tears to Eleanor's eyes when she remembered it. His official position had done much to silence the more persistent gossips, though Mrs. Patterson continued to make pointed comments about the impropriety of Eleanor's friendship with the town's newest resident. Eleanor paused at a letter dated just 3 months after her wedding to Thomas, reading his familiar handwriting. "My dearest Eleanor, I know we promised to love each other until death do us part, but I find myself hoping that love extends beyond even that boundary. If something should happen to me, I want you to know that your happiness would matter to me more than any lingering grief. A heart that can love deeply once can love deeply again, and I would consider it the greatest tribute to our marriage if you found joy with someone worthy of the remarkable woman you are." The words blurred as tears filled Eleanor's eyes. Thomas had written this letter during a particularly dangerous supply run, when the threat of conflict with local tribes had made his journey more perilous than usual. She had read it countless times during the dark months after his death, but tonight the words carried a different weight, a permission she hadn't realized she needed. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reverie. Eleanor wiped her eyes and glanced at the clock. It was nearly 9, unusually late for visitors in Ash Hollow. She opened the door to find Reed standing on her porch, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wondering if you might have some tea. I haven't been sleeping well, and I thought perhaps—" Eleanor stepped aside immediately, noting the tremor in his hands and the haunted look in his eyes. "Of course. Come in." As she prepared tea on her kitchen stove, Eleanor observed Reed from the corner of her eye. He sat at her kitchen table with his shoulders hunched, his usual composure fractured by whatever demons had driven him from his bed. Since moving to the caretaker's cottage, their evening meals had continued, but Eleanor had noticed a gradual change in Reed's demeanor. He seemed more anxious, more prone to startled reactions at unexpected sounds, more likely to stare off into the distance with an expression of profound sadness. "Bad dreams again?" Eleanor asked gently as she set a steaming cup before him. Reed wrapped his hands around the cup, as if drawing warmth from it. "They've been getting worse, more vivid. Sometimes I wake up and for a moment I don't know where I am." Eleanor settled into the chair across from him, studying his face in the lamplight. "Do you want to talk about them?" Reed was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I dream about the war, about the men who died under my command, about the choices I made, and the choices I should have made differently." "You were an officer?" Eleanor asked softly. "Lieutenant. Later, Captain. I led a company of good men into situations that I knew were likely to get them killed." Reed's hands tightened around the teacup. "That's what war is. Eleanor sending good men to die for causes they barely understand, in places they never wanted to be." Eleanor reached across the table and covered one of his hands with hers. "The war is over, Reed. You survived. You came through it and found your way here, to people who care about you. But I shouldn't have survived," Reed said, his voice breaking slightly. "Better men than me died, Eleanor. Men with wives and children, men with futures worth preserving. I should have been the one to—" "Stop," Eleanor said firmly. "Reed, look at me." He raised his eyes to meet hers, and Eleanor saw the raw pain that he had been carrying like a weight on his soul. "Survivor's guilt is a terrible burden," she said gently. "Doc Morrison told me about it once, when he was treating a man who came through here after the war ended. It's the feeling that you somehow don't deserve to live when others died. But Reed, those men who died, they wouldn't want you to destroy yourself with guilt. They would want you to live, to find purpose, to honor their memory by being the best man you can be." Reed's eyes filled with tears that he tried to blink away. "You don't understand. There are things I did, decisions I made." "Tell me," Eleanor said simply. For a moment, Reed looked as if he might speak, might finally share the burden that was clearly eating away at him. But then his expression closed off, and he shook his head. "I can't. Not yet. Maybe not ever." Eleanor felt a flash of frustration, but she pushed it aside. "Then don't tell me, but don't let whatever happened in the past destroy what you're building here in the present." They sat in silence for several minutes, Eleanor's hand still covering Reed's, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Reed spoke again. "Sometimes I wonder if I should leave Ash Hollow, find some place where I don't have to worry about my past catching up with me." Eleanor felt a stab of panic at the thought of Reed leaving. "Is someone looking for you?" Reed's hesitation before answering told Eleanor more than his words did. "I don't know. Maybe. The war left a lot of loose ends, a lot of unfinished business." "What kind of unfinished business?" Reed pulled his hand away from hers and stood up, beginning to pace around her small kitchen. "Eleanor, there are things about my service record, about how I left the army, that might not reflect well on me if they came to light." Eleanor felt a chill of apprehension, but she kept her voice steady. "What kind of things?" Reed stopped pacing and looked at her directly. "What if I told you that I didn't complete my service honorably? What if I told you that I left my post without permission, that I abandoned my duty?" Eleanor considered his words carefully. "Are you telling me that you deserted?" Reed's silence was answer enough. Eleanor rose from her chair and approached him slowly, noting how he tensed as if preparing for rejection. "Reed, were you in danger? Were you protecting yourself or others?" "It's more complicated than that," Reed said quietly. "Then explain it to me, help me understand." Reed looked at her with an expression of such longing and fear that Eleanor's heart ached for him. "I want to tell you everything, Eleanor. But I'm terrified that when you know the truth about me, you'll look at me differently. You'll see me the way I see myself." Eleanor reached up and cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Reed Mallory, I have seen you work tirelessly to help this community. I have watched you be gentle with children and respectful to elders. I have seen you risk your own health to complete tasks that benefit others. Whatever happened in the war, whatever mistakes you think you made, they don't erase the man you are now." Reed leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as if her words were a balm to his wounded spirit. "You have such faith in people, Eleanor. Sometimes I think it will be your downfall. And sometimes I think your lack of faith in yourself will be yours," Eleanor replied. "You're a good man, Reed. I wish you could see yourself the way I see you." Reed opened his eyes and looked at her with an intensity that made Eleanor's breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and she realized that she wanted him to. But instead, he stepped back, putting distance between them. "I should go," he said. "It's late, and you need your rest." Eleanor wanted to protest, wanted to ask him to stay and continue their conversation, but she sensed that Reed had shared as much as he was capable of sharing for one night. "Will you be able to sleep now?" "I think so. Thank you for the tea, and for listening." Eleanor walked him to the door, noting how his shoulders seemed less burdened than when he had arrived. "Reed, whatever secrets you're carrying, they don't have to define you. You have a life here now, people who care about you. Don't let the past rob you of the future you deserve." Reed paused at the threshold, his hand on the doorframe. "What if the past won't stay in the past?" "Then we'll face it together," Eleanor said without hesitation. "Whatever comes, you don't have to face it alone." Reed smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him all evening. "I don't deserve you, Eleanor Grace. Lucky for you, I don't agree, Eleanor replied. After Reed left, Eleanor returned to her bedroom and picked up Thomas's Bible again. She turned to the letter that had moved her to tears earlier, reading once more his words about love extending beyond death and the importance of finding joy with someone worthy. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself thinking about the conversation she had just shared with Reed, about the pain he was carrying and the secrets he was afraid to reveal. She didn't know what exactly Reed was hiding, but she knew that it was something serious enough to make him consider leaving everything he had built in Ash Hollow. Eleanor made a decision that night, lying in her bed and listening to the wind whisper across the prairie. Whatever Reed's past contained, whatever mistakes he had made or choices he regretted, she would stand by him. She had seen the man he was beneath the guilt and fear, and that man was worth fighting for. The pressed flowers in Thomas's Bible had taught her that beautiful things could be preserved even after they seemed to have died, that love could survive in unexpected forms. Perhaps Reed's past didn't have to destroy their future together. Perhaps love really could overcome the weight of old sins and half-forgotten sorrows. As Eleanor drifted off to sleep, she whispered a prayer for Reed's peace of mind, and for the courage they would both need to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Tomorrow was Sunday, and she would ask Reed to accompany her to church services. It was time for him to take another step toward full acceptance in the community, and it was time for Eleanor to publicly acknowledge that Reed Mallory had become more than just a friend who shared her evening meals. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, but Eleanor had learned something important that evening. Love required courage, and courage required faith, faith in the possibility that broken people could heal, that the past could be forgiven, and that two lonely souls could find completeness in each other's company. The hand-carved wooden horse that Reed had spent his evenings crafting for little Sarah Mitchell represented something more precious than its simple appearance suggested. Eleanor watched him put the finishing touches on the toy as they sat together on her cottage porch, his movements careful and precise despite the fading light. Sarah had been ill with a spring fever for nearly a week, and Reed had noticed her absence from school with the same attention he paid to every detail of the community's well-being. "The proportions are perfect," Eleanor observed, admiring the graceful curve of the horse's neck and the delicate carving of its mane. "Where did you learn to work with wood like that?" Reed paused in his sanding, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "My father was a carpenter before the war changed everything. He taught me that making something beautiful with your hands was a way of putting a piece of your soul into the world." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest at this rare glimpse into Reed's family history. He spoke so infrequently about his past that each small revelation felt like a precious gift. "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," Reed agreed, his voice growing softer. "He used to say that a man could be measured by what he chose to build, rather than what he chose to tear down." Reed's hands stilled on the wooden horse. "I haven't lived up to that standard, Eleanor. I've torn down more than I've built." Eleanor reached over and covered his hand with hers, stilling his self-recrimination. "Look around you, Reed. Look at what you've built here in just 2 months. The schoolhouse runs more smoothly than it has in years. The children light up when they see you. The entire community has benefited from your presence." Reed turned his hand palm up, intertwining his fingers with hers. The gesture was becoming more natural between them, though it still sent a little thrill through Eleanor every time they touched. "I never expected to find a place like this. People who would accept me without knowing everything about where I came from. Maybe that's because people can sense goodness," Eleanor suggested. "Children especially. They don't care about your past credentials or your family name. They just know that you're kind to them." As if summoned by their conversation, Tommy Henderson appeared around the corner of the cottage, his face flushed with excitement. "Miss Grace, Mr. Reed, guess what happened?" Eleanor and Reed exchanged amused glances at Tommy's enthusiasm. "What's got you so excited, son?" Reed asked. "Pa says I can help with the spring planting this year. Real help, not just carrying water buckets. He's going to teach me how to work the plow and everything." Tommy's pride was evident in every word. "That's wonderful, Tommy," Eleanor said. Your father must trust you quite a bit to give you such important responsibilities. He says I've been showing more maturity lately, Tommy explained, then looked directly at Reed. He says talking to you about things has helped me understand what being a man really means. Reed's expression grew serious and slightly uncomfortable. Tommy, being a man isn't something another person can teach you. It's something you discover about yourself through your choices and actions. But you helped me understand about thinking before acting and about considering how my choices affect other people, Tommy insisted. Like when I wanted to run off to the lumber camp. You helped me see that real strength sometimes means staying and doing your duty, even when it's not exciting. Eleanor felt a surge of affection for both the earnest boy and the man who had unknowingly become his mentor. Reed's influence on Tommy had been gradual but profound, helping the boy channel his restless energy into more constructive pursuits. Your father is a good man, Tommy, Reed said. Listen to him, work hard, and remember that the best kind of strength is the kind that helps other people. After Tommy ran off to share his news with the other children, Eleanor and Reed sat in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent toward the horizon. Eleanor found herself studying Reed's profile, noting the way the golden light softened the worry lines around his eyes and highlighted the premature grey at his temples. You're good with him, she said. With all the children, really. You have a natural way of guiding them without lecturing or talking down to them. Reed resumed his work on the wooden horse, using the activity to avoid meeting Eleanor's eyes. Children deserve honesty. They can sense when adults are being false with them. Is that why you're struggling so much with your secrets? Eleanor asked gently. Because being honest with me means being honest with yourself about things you'd rather forget. Reed's hands stilled again, and Eleanor saw his jaw tighten with the effort of holding back words he wasn't ready to speak. She had become skilled at reading these moments, when Reed wrestled with his conscience, torn between his desire to confide in her and his fear of the consequences. Eleanor, Reed said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, what if I told you that I've done things that can't be forgiven? What if I told you that the man you think you know is someone I wish I could be, but not someone I actually am? Eleanor turned in her chair to face him fully. Then I would tell you that we all have things we wish we could change about ourselves. The question isn't whether you've made mistakes, Reed. The question is whether you're committed to being better than you were. Reed finally looked at her, his brown eyes reflecting a pain so deep that Eleanor felt it as a physical ache. What if being better isn't enough? What if the things I've done require a price that I haven't paid yet? Eleanor felt a chill of apprehension, but she kept her voice steady. What kind of price? Reed was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the wooden horse in his hands. In the war, Eleanor, sometimes good men are forced to make impossible choices. Sometimes there's no right answer, only degrees of wrong. Tell me about one of those choices, Eleanor said softly. Reed's grip tightened on the wooden horse, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might break the delicate carving. There was a battly small engagement that most people have probably forgotten by now. My company was ordered to hold a position that couldn't be held, to buy time for a larger retreat. Eleanor waited, sensing that Reed needed to tell this story at his own pace. We were outnumbered 3-1, low on ammunition, and cut off from support. I had 43 men under my command, good men who trusted me to make the right decisions. Reed's voice grew hoarse. I could have followed orders, held the position until we were all dead. That would have been the honorable thing, the military thing. But you didn't, Eleanor said quietly. I ordered a retreat. I made the decision that my men's lives were worth more than following orders that would accomplish nothing except getting them killed. Reed looked up at Eleanor with an expression of anguish. 12 men died in that retreat, Eleanor. 12 good men who might still be alive if I had been a better tactician, a better leader. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the pain in Reed's voice. How many men would have died if you had followed orders? All of them. All 43. Then you saved 31 lives, Eleanor said firmly. You made an impossible choice and saved 31 men who were able to go home to their families because of your decision. Reed shook his head. The army didn't see it that way. I was relieved of command, court-martialed for failure to follow orders. The only reason I wasn't shot for cowardice was because some of my men testified on my behalf. Eleanor began to understand the weight that Reed had been carrying. What happened after the court-martial? I was stripped of rank, dishonorably discharged, and left to find my own way home from a war zone. Reed's voice was flat now, empty of emotion. I walked for 3 months through enemy territory, sleeping in barns when I was lucky, in ditches when I wasn't. Reed, Eleanor said, reaching for his hands again. You were punished for saving lives. That doesn't make you a bad man. It makes you a man who valued human life over military protocol. It makes me a deserter, Reed said bluntly. A man who abandoned his duty when things got difficult. Eleanor felt a flash of anger, not at Reed, but at the system that had punished him for acting with conscience and compassion. You didn't abandon your duty to your men. You honored it by choosing their lives over abstract principles. Reed looked at her with an expression of desperate hope mixed with disbelief. How can you say that? How can you look at me the same way after knowing what I did? Eleanor leaned forward, taking the wooden horse from his hands and setting it aside so she could hold both of his hands in hers. Because I know you, Reed Mallory. I know the man who spends his evenings carving toys for sick children. I know the man who fixed our school bell and rebuilt our front steps without being asked. I know the man who helped a lost boy understand the value of education over quick money. Tears were flowing freely down Reed's cheeks now, years of guilt and self-condemnation finally finding release. But what if someone comes looking for me? What if my presence here brings trouble to you and the children and everyone who's been kind to me? Eleanor squeezed his hands tighter. Then we'll face that trouble together. Reed, you're not the same man who walked away from that battlefield. You found a new purpose here, a new way to serve and protect people. If your past catches up with you, we'll deal with it when it happens. Reed pulled one hand free and cupped Eleanor's cheek, his thumb gently wiping away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. I don't deserve your faith in me. Lucky for you, love isn't about deserving, Eleanor replied, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The admission hung in the air between them, changing something fundamental in their relationship. Reed's eyes widened slightly, and Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment at her unguarded honesty. Eleanor, Reed whispered, his voice filled with wonder and fear in equal measure. Before either of them could say anything more, the moment was interrupted by the approach of Doc Morrison, who was making his way up the path to Eleanor's cottage with his medical bag in hand. Evening, folks, the doctor called. Eleanor, I was hoping to catch you. I just came from the Mitchell place, and little Sarah is asking for her teacher. Her fever broke this afternoon, but she's been fretting about missing school. Eleanor and Reed quickly composed themselves, though Eleanor could still feel the lingering intensity of their interrupted moment. Is she well enough for visitors? I think a brief visit from her favorite teacher might be just the medicine she needs, Doc Morrison said with a smile. Then he noticed the wooden horse sitting on the porch rail. Well, I'll be. Reed, did you make that? Reed cleared his throat, his voice still slightly rough from emotion. It's for Sarah. I thought she might like something to play with while she recovers. Doc Morrison picked up the horse and examined it with obvious admiration. This is beautiful work. The craftsmanship is exceptional. He looked between Eleanor and Reed with the knowing expression of a man who had delivered half the babies in Ash Hollow and had developed a keen sense for understanding human relationships. Sarah's going to treasure this. Eleanor rose from her chair, grateful for the excuse to collect herself. I'll walk over with you, Doc. Reed, would you like to come along? Reed nodded, pocketing the wooden horse and following them down the path. As they walked through the gathering dusk toward the Mitchell farm, Eleanor found herself acutely aware of Reed's presence beside her, of the conversation they had shared and the admission she had made. She had told Reed that she loved him, and while the words had been spoken in the context of defending his character, they had also been true in the deepest sense. Somewhere between their first shared meal and this evening's revelation about his past, Eleanor had fallen in love with the quiet, damaged man who had appeared at her gate like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. The question now was what they would do with that love, and whether Reed's troubled past would allow them to build the future that Eleanor was beginning to envision for them both. The faded military photograph that Reed kept hidden in the bottom of his saddlebags showed a different man than the one Eleanor had come to know. In the sepia-toned image, a younger Reed stood at attention with his company, his uniform crisp and his expression confident in the way that only young men who had not yet seen the true cost of war could manage. Eleanor discovered the photograph by accident 3 weeks after their evening conversation about his court-martial, when a spring storm blew through Ash Hollow with unusual fury and damaged the roof of the caretaker's cottage. Reed had been helping Mayor Jameson secure loose shutters around town when the worst of the storm hit, leaving Eleanor to gather his scattered belongings from where the wind had blown them through his broken window. She hadn't intended to pry, but the photograph had fallen from his saddlebags along with other papers, and something about the young soldier's face had caught her attention. The man in the photograph looked like Reed, but he also looked like someone who had never known doubt or failure. His shoulders were squared with military bearing, his eyes clear and certain. It was difficult to reconcile this image with the gentle, troubled man who carved wooden toys for sick children and wrestled with nightmares about decisions made in impossible circumstances. Eleanor was still studying the photograph when Reed returned from his storm duties, soaked to the skin and exhausted from hours of emergency work around town. He stopped short when he saw what she was holding, his face going pale beneath his weather-burned complexion. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said quickly. "The wind scattered your things, and I was just trying to gather them up. I didn't mean to intrude on your privacy." Reed approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the photograph in her hands. "That was taken just before my first real engagement. I thought I knew everything there was to know about leading men and fighting wars." His laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. "I was so arrogant, so certain that courage and good intentions were enough to see us through anything." Eleanor handed him the photograph, noting how his fingers trembled slightly as he took it. "You look so young." "I was young, 22 years old, and convinced that the world made sense, that there were clear lines between right and wrong, that good men always prevailed if they fought hard enough." Reed stared at the image of his younger self. "The war taught me that most of those beliefs were just comfortable illusions." Eleanor helped Reed gather the rest of his belongings, noting the other items that had spilled from his saddlebags. A worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, a small Bible with pages soft from handling, and several other official-looking documents that she didn't examine closely. Each item told a story about the man Reed had been and the journey that had brought him to Ash Hollow. "Reed," Eleanor said as they finished cleaning up the storm damage, "would you like to come to the spring festival with me next week?" Reed paused in his work, a hammer halfway to the nail he was driving. "As your escort?" "As my escort," Eleanor confirmed, her heart racing at her own boldness. "It's time for people to see us together as more than just friends who share evening meals." Reed set down his hammer and looked at her with an expression that mixed hope with apprehension. "Eleanor, are you certain, once we appear together publicly like that, there'll be no taking it back? People will talk, make assumptions." "Let them talk," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm tired of hiding how I feel about you. I'm tired of pretending that what's growing between us is just friendship." Reed crossed the small space between them and took her hands in his. "I love you, Eleanor Grace. I've loved you since that first night when you offered to share your dessert with a starving stranger. But I'm terrified that my past will destroy whatever future we might have together." "Then let's face the future together," Eleanor replied. "Whatever comes, we'll be stronger dealing with it as a couple than we would be facing it alone." The spring festival arrived with perfect weather and the kind of community excitement that Ash Hollow hadn't seen in years. Eleanor spent the morning helping the other women prepare food for the communal feast, while Reed joined the men in setting up tables and a small platform for dancing. Throughout the day, Eleanor found herself stealing glances at Reed, noting how naturally he had integrated into the fabric of the community. When evening came and the dancing began, Reed approached Eleanor with formal courtesy, bowing slightly as he extended his hand. "Miss Grace, would you do me the honor of dancing with me?" Eleanor accepted his hand with a smile that felt bright enough to light the entire festival. "I would be delighted, Mr. Mallory." Their first dance together was a simple waltz, but to Eleanor it felt like the most important moment of her life. Reed was a skilled dancer, leading her with gentle confidence as they moved to the music provided by Sam Kowalski's fiddle and Doc Morrison's surprisingly melodic harmonica. Around them, other couples swayed to the same rhythm, but Eleanor felt as if she and Reed were dancing alone under the vast Nebraska sky. "You're beautiful," Reed murmured as they moved together, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "You're not bad yourself," Eleanor replied, earning a genuine laugh that transformed Reed's face with joy. As the evening progressed, Eleanor noticed how the community's acceptance of their relationship was becoming evident. Mayor Jameson nodded approvingly as they passed. Mrs. Henderson complimented them on how well they looked together, and even some of Mrs. Patterson's supporters seemed to be softening their disapproval in the face of the obvious happiness that Eleanor and Reed brought to each other. It was during their third dance that Eleanor noticed the stranger watching them from the edge of the crowd. He was a tall man with military bearing, dressed in travel clothes that had seen hard use. Something about his presence made Eleanor uneasy, though she couldn't quite identify why. Reed noticed her distraction and followed her gaze to the stranger. The change in Reed's demeanor was immediate, and alarming, his face went pale. His grip on Eleanor's hand tightened, and his entire body went rigid with tension. "Reed," Eleanor asked quietly, "do you know that man?" Reed didn't answer immediately, but Eleanor could feel the tremor that ran through his body. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We need to leave. Now." Eleanor allowed Reed to lead her away from the dancing area, noting how he kept his head down and tried to avoid drawing attention to their departure. They made it halfway to Eleanor's cottage before the stranger's voice cut through the night air. "Captain Reed Mallory, or should I say former Captain Mallory." Reed stopped walking, his shoulders sagging as if a great weight had settled on them. He turned slowly to face the stranger, positioning himself slightly in front of Eleanor in a protective gesture. "Colonel Harrison," Reed said, his voice steady despite the obvious tension in his posture. "I wondered when someone would come looking for me." Colonel Harrison approached them with measured steps, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. Eleanor felt a chill of fear as she realized that this man represented the military justice that Reed had been fleeing from. "The Army has a long memory, Mallory," Colonel Harrison said, "and we don't like loose ends. You've been living under an assumed name, avoiding military authorities, essentially continuing your desertion for 2 years now." "My name is Reed Mallory," Reed said firmly. "I've never used any other name." "But you've never reported to military authorities either, have you? You've been hiding in frontier towns, hoping we'd forget about you." Colonel Harrison's eyes shifted to Eleanor. "And you've been involving civilians in your deception." Eleanor stepped forward, her fear transforming into protective anger. "Colonel Harrison, Mr. Mallory is a respected member of this community. He has an official position, people who depend on him." "Miss, this man is a deserter who abandoned his post in wartime," Colonel Harrison interrupted. "Whatever lies he's told you about his service record, the truth is that he's a fugitive from military justice." Reed placed a gentle hand on Eleanor's arm, silently asking her to let him handle the confrontation. "Colonel, I accept that I'm still subject to military authority, but I'd like to request that this matter be handled with minimal disruption to the community. These people have done nothing wrong." "That depends entirely on your cooperation," Colonel Harrison said. "You can come with me willingly, face the consequences of your actions, and this town can continue its peaceful existence. Or you can resist, force me to involve local authorities, and turn this into a spectacle that will damage everyone involved." Eleanor felt her world tilting as she realized that Reed was going to surrender himself to protect the community that had embraced him. "Reed, no, you can't just—" "Eleanor," Reed said softly, turning to face her with eyes full of love and regret. I always knew this day might come. I won't let my problems destroy what you've built here. What we've built here, Eleanor corrected, tears streaming down her cheeks. Reed, please, there has to be another way. Reed cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. You gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. You showed me that I was capable of being loved, despite everything I've done. That's something no one can ever take away from me. Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them all turn. Mayor Jameson was walking toward them with determined strides, flanked by Doc Morrison and several other prominent members of the community. Gentlemen, Mayor Jameson said, addressing both Reed and Colonel Harrison, I couldn't help but overhear part of your conversation. Perhaps we could discuss this matter in a more civilized setting. Colonel Harrison's expression grew impatient. Mayor, this is a military matter that doesn't concern civilian authorities. With respect, Colonel, anything that affects the welfare of our community concerns us. Mayor Jameson replied firmly. Mr. Mallory is an official employee of the town of Ash Hollow, and he has responsibilities that can't simply be abandoned without due process. Doc Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face set in determined lines. Colonel, I've seen men come back from that war carrying wounds that never heal. Some of those wounds are visible, and some aren't. But I've also seen men find ways to heal by helping others, by building instead of destroying. That's very touching, Doctor, but it doesn't change the legal facts, Colonel Harrison said. This man is a deserter, and deserters must face the consequences of their actions. Tommy Henderson's voice cut through the adult conversation with the clear moral certainty that only children possessed. Mr. Reed's not a bad man, he helps everybody. He teaches us things and fixes stuff and... Tommy, Eleanor said gently, but the boy had already sparked something in the gathered crowd. Other children began to speak up, their voices overlapping as they defended the man who had become a quiet mentor to all of them. He carved me a horse when I was sick, Sarah Mitchell said, clutching the wooden toy that Reed had made for her. He helped me understand why school matters, Tommy added. He fixed our bell, so it sounds pretty again, another child chimed in. Colonel Harrison looked around at the growing crowd of townspeople, his expression growing uncomfortable as he realized that his simple military operation was becoming complicated by community politics. These testimonials are irrelevant, he said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Military law is clear about desertion. Military law during wartime. Doc Morrison interrupted. But the war's been over for 2 years, Colonel, and this man has spent those 2 years serving his community, helping rebuild what the war destroyed. Eleanor watched Reed's face as the people of Ash Hollow rallied to his defense, saw the amazement and gratitude in his expression as he realized that he wasn't alone in this fight. The man who had believed himself unworthy of redemption was discovering that an entire community considered him worth defending. Mayor Jameson pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. Colonel Harrison, I took the liberty of reviewing Mr. Mallory's service record, which is a matter of public documentation. What I found was a soldier who served with distinction for 3 years, who saved dozens of lives through his tactical decisions, and who was punished for prioritizing the welfare of his men over strict adherence to orders that would have resulted in unnecessary casualties. Colonel Harrison's hand moved to the document, his expression growing uncertain. Where did you get this? From the same military archives that sent you here, Mayor Jameson replied. What I find interesting is that your orders don't seem to account for the full context of Captain Mallory's service record or the circumstances that led to his departure from the army. Eleanor held her breath as Colonel Harrison read the document, noting how his expression gradually shifted from certainty to confusion to something that might have been doubt. These commendations, I wasn't aware of the full extent of Captain Mallory's service record, Colonel Harrison admitted slowly. Reed spoke for the first time since the confrontation had begun escalating. Colonel, I accept full responsibility for leaving my post without permission. I won't ask for forgiveness for that decision, but I will ask that you consider the lives I saved by making it, and the life I've tried to build since then. Colonel Harrison looked around at the faces surrounding him, adults and children alike, all united in their support for the man they knew as a gentle carpenter and mentor. Finally, his gaze settled on Eleanor, who was still standing close to Reed, with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Miss, what is this man to you?" Colonel Harrison asked. Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting the colonel's gaze directly. "He's the man I love. He's the man I plan to marry, if he'll have me. He's the best man I've ever known, and I don't care what mistakes he made in a war that asked impossible things of good people." Reed turned to stare at her, his expression a mixture of shock and overwhelming emotion. "Eleanor." "Reed Mallory," Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "I know this isn't the most romantic setting, but I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" The silence that followed Eleanor's proposal stretched for what felt like eternity. Then Reed dropped to one knee right there in the dirt street, taking Eleanor's hands in his as the entire community watched. "Eleanor Grace," Reed said, his voice thick with emotion, "I would be honored to marry you. You've given me a reason to believe in redemption, in second chances, in the possibility that broken people can heal and become whole again." The cheer that went up from the assembled townspeople could probably be heard 3 counties over. Eleanor pulled Reed to his feet and kissed him properly for the first time, not caring who was watching or what anyone might think about public displays of affection. When they finally broke apart, Colonel Harrison was shaking his head with an expression that might have been amusement. "Well, this is certainly not how I expected this evening to proceed." Mayor Jameson clapped the colonel on the shoulder. "Colonel, in my experience, the best military outcomes are often the ones that nobody saw coming. Perhaps we could discuss this matter over a drink and see if we can find a solution that serves everyone's interests." Colonel Harrison looked once more at Reed and Eleanor, noting how they stood together with their hands clasped and their faces shining with happiness. "Captain Mallory, your service record shows that you were once an exemplary officer who made a difficult decision under impossible circumstances. The fact that you've spent the past 2 years serving your community suggests that you found a constructive way to atone for any errors in judgment." Reed straightened his shoulders, and for a moment Eleanor could see the soldier he had once been. "Sir, I accept full responsibility for my actions and their consequences. What I'm prepared to do," Colonel Harrison continued, "is recommend that your case be reviewed by a military tribunal with full consideration of your service record and post-war conduct. In the meantime, I see no reason why you can't continue your duties here, assuming you report to military authorities on a regular basis." Eleanor felt her knees go weak with relief. It wasn't a complete pardon, but it was a reprieve, a chance for Reed to build his case for redemption with the support of the community that had embraced him. "Thank you, sir," Reed said simply. Colonel Harrison smiled for the first time that evening. "Don't thank me yet, Captain. Thank this community that was willing to fight for you, and thank the woman who just proposed to you in front of half the Nebraska territory." The wedding took place 3 months later, on a perfect autumn day, when the prairie grass had turned golden and the sky stretched endlessly blue above the small church where Thomas had been laid to rest and where Eleanor now prepared to begin a new chapter of her life. Reed had spent the summer working with military authorities to resolve his status, ultimately receiving an honorable discharge in recognition of his service record and post-war conduct. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of prairie wildflowers that Reed had picked for her that morning. Reed wore a new suit that the community had pitched in to buy for him, looking handsome and nervous as he waited at the altar for his bride. The church was packed with every resident of Ash Hollow and several neighboring settlements, all gathered to witness the union of their beloved schoolteacher and the quiet man who had become an indispensable part of their community. Tommy Henderson served as ring-bearer, carrying the simple bands that Reed had forged himself from silver coins, while Sarah Mitchell scattered flower petals with solemn concentration. As Eleanor walked down the aisle, she caught sight of something that made her smile through her tears. Thomas's Bible lying open on the front pew. displaying the page with his letter about love extending beyond death and the importance of finding joy with someone worthy. She had read that letter aloud to Reed the night before their wedding, sharing Thomas's blessing on their union. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt, conducted by the circuit preacher who visited Ash Hollow once a month. When Reed slipped the ring onto Eleanor's finger, his hands were steady and sure, and when she looked into his eyes, she saw not the haunted drifter who had appeared at her gate, but a man who had found peace and purpose and the courage to believe in love again. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced, and Reed complied with enthusiasm that earned cheers and applause from the assembled guests. The reception that followed was a community celebration that lasted well into the evening. Tables groaned under the weight of contributed dishes, Sam Kowalski's fiddle sang out lively tunes for dancing, and the children ran between the adults with the boundless energy that comes from too much cake and excitement. As the sun set over the prairie, casting long shadows across the celebration, Eleanor and Reed found themselves standing together at the edge of the festivities, watching their friends and neighbors enjoy the party that marked the beginning of their married life. "Are you happy?" Reed asked, slipping his arm around Eleanor's waist. "I'm more than happy," Eleanor replied, leaning into his embrace. "I'm complete." Reed kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of the wildflowers in her hair. "2 years ago, I was a broken man with nothing to live for. Tonight, I'm married to the most remarkable woman in the world, surrounded by people who have become my family." Eleanor looked up at him, noting how the worry lines around his eyes had softened, how his shoulders no longer carried the weight of unbearable guilt. "We both found something we didn't know we were looking for. Second chances," Reed said softly. "And the courage to take them," Eleanor added. As the evening wound down and their guests began to drift home, Eleanor and Reed made their way to the small house that the community had helped Reed build behind the schoolhouse. It was modest but well-crafted, with a kitchen garden that Eleanor had planted and a front porch where they could continue their tradition of sharing evening meals. The house was a wedding gift from the town, a symbol of how completely Reed had been accepted into the fabric of Ash Hollow's community. Every room contained something contributed by their neighbor, curtains sewn by Mrs. Henderson, furniture crafted by the men of the town, dishes and linens gathered from various households to help the newlyweds start their life together. In their bedroom, Eleanor had placed Thomas's Bible on the nightstand next to a small framed photograph from their wedding day. The past and present coexisted peacefully, each honoring the other in the life that Eleanor and Reed were building together. That night, as they lay in their marriage bed, listening to the wind whisper across the prairie, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been a lonely widow, eating solitary meals and building walls around her heart. Tonight, she was a woman beloved, a partner in a marriage built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "Reed," she whispered in the darkness. "Yes? That first night, when I offered you dessert, did you ever imagine it would lead to this?" Reed was quiet for a moment, considering her question. "I imagined that you were an angel, and that sharing a meal with you was the kindest thing that had happened to me in years. I never dared imagine that it was the beginning of the rest of my life." Eleanor turned in his arms, finding his face in the darkness and tracing the beloved features with gentle fingers. "I love you, Reed Mallory." "And I love you, Eleanor Mallory," Reed replied, the name feeling natural and right on his lips. Outside their window, the Nebraska sky stretched vast and star-filled above their small town, holding infinite possibilities for the future. Inside their modest home, two people who had found each other against all odds settled into sleep with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that love, real, lasting, transformative love, had triumphed over loneliness, guilt, and fear. The wooden horse that Reed had carved for Sarah Mitchell sat on the mantelpiece, a reminder that the most precious gifts are often the simplest ones, given freely and received with gratitude. Like the shared meal that had started their love story, It represented the profound truth that human connection begins with small acts of kindness and grows into something beautiful when nurtured with patience, faith, and hope. In the years that followed, Eleanor and Reed would face the normal challenges that come with building a life together, but they would face them as partners, united by the love that had grown from a moment of simple generosity on a dusty schoolhouse porch. Their story would become part of Ash Hollow's folklore, told and retold by generations of children who learned from their example that love is not about perfection, but about choosing to see the best in each other and having the courage to build something beautiful together. The brass bell that Reed had repaired continued to call children to their lessons each morning, its clear tone ringing out across the prairie as a reminder that broken things could be mended, that communities could heal, and that sometimes the most important lessons were learned not from books, but from watching two people choose love over fear and hope over despair. And every evening, as the sun set over the vast Nebraska landscape, Eleanor and Reed continued their tradition of sharing supper together. Their simple meals transformed into celebrations of the love that had grown from a starving cowboy's silent plea and a lonely teacher's generous heart.